All right, let's talk NBA with Ben Taylor from Thinking Basketball, by far the smartest YouTube channel covering the NBA. Ben, how you doing, man?
I don't know about by far. We certainly cover the NBA. That's we could say that safely.
If you're listening, not watching, Ben's like shaking his head in disbelief. If you've watched Thinking Basketball, you know how amazing the channel is. So I'm looking forward to talking to you, Ben. It's been a while since we did a pod. For the listeners, we're recording this ahead of Thursday night's game. So before we talk about the state of the NBA overall and a great video you made earlier this season, I want to hit some of the latest news and trends across the league, Ben, starting with the Celtics. Feels like they're starting to hit their peak right now. 12-1 in March. Beat the Suns by 30 on Wednesday without Jason Tatum. And Kristaps Porzingis, monster night for him. In 5 games this month, 24.4 points, 29 minutes per game, shooting 40% from 3, 8.2 boards per game. KP, when he's playing at the level that he is now, the Celtics feel like the absolute finals favorites to me on a tier of their own. Do you think that's fair to say?
Ooh, wow. Those are fighting words in Oklahoma City. I don't know if I would go that far. I think those two teams, along with Cleveland, of course, are sort of in a tier of their own in this season. They've just had incredible seasons. Oklahoma City, to me, is the one when I'm pushed, when push comes to shove, I'm always giving them a little bit of an edge. And some of it has to do with how they match up. The Celtics and the Thunder in particular are so versatile and they can give you so many different looks. And I think you see that when they play other top teams, but then when they play each other, it's like, oh, actually there's this other team like the Celtics that have, different lineups they can throw at you, different coverages they can throw at you, different game plans they can throw at you. And the Celtics in particular are very surgical about how they try to attack. And one of the things I was wondering about the game they played recently in Boston, which the Thunder won without Jalen Williams, because apparently the Thunder don't even need all their players. It's kind of ridiculous at this point. But who do the Celtics hunt in mismatch situations against some of the lineups they throw out there? Because the Thunder have so many good defenders, because the Thunder can put these lineups where, occasionally Isaiah Joe will be your weakest defender. But I think there was one stretch where they were like, we'll try to hunt Shai Gilgeous-Alexander in isolation. And I don't know if that's the greatest idea. Maybe technically he's the weakest man defender. So I don't know if I'd go that far. The thing with the Celtics, of course, is, how good they are when they're all healthy. And Al Horford is just like this ageless wonder. He's absolutely incredible. But I was going to ask you with Porzingis, he had this mysterious illness, this mysterious respiratory illness. Has that been solved, or was that like last night? I was like, oh, so Tatum's not out, so they just throw Porzingis into the game and they just never miss a beat.
The conspiracy theorist in me wonders if this whole thing was just BS, because they've been load managing him throughout the year. They've been very, very safe with bringing him back. They want to pace him. They don't want him to get injured or hurt. And he has dealt with some real physical stuff over the course of the season. So with this mystery illness, even though he sat on the bench with his teammates at one point, with this illness that he can't shake. I don't know if this is actually real, but it seems like
weird viruses like that. There are weird viruses that are mysterious that aren't really contagious.
Yes.
But yeah, I was curious when, I don't think it's a huge achievement for the Celtics this season to beat a team like Phoenix without Tatum.
No.
But certainly when I opened up the box score last night when they started to pull away, I was like, that's interesting. Porzingis is back. Okay.
Sure. Phoenix's defense is absolutely horrific, but KP, look, they're leaving him open to start the game. He's draining threes, and then he starts attacking closeouts. Once they start closing out on him, he's pumping by Richards, a pump fake by KD. He's posting up Booker, posting up Martin, KD, O'Neal. The dude's so versatile. He just adds that extra ingredient to that team that does make them on a higher overall level, especially against Cleveland, who's, sputtered as of late. We'll see how that translates, come April and maybe May. But Thunder, you mentioned OKC. I agree with you. OKC, I've debated on this podcast a lot recently about, people say a lower seed could beat them. I don't believe that to be the case with Oklahoma City. I think this team is pretty special defensively. They're one of the few teams in the league, Boston included, where they have no holes defensively. the Clippers, when Kawhi is healthy, are probably in that category as well, but there's like no weaknesses except for maybe sometimes Harden, but he's not horrible by any means.
Well, I don't think the Clippers small ball can compete with the Thunder small ball, and
they don't have that ingredient.
Yeah, Zubats has been great for them, but you still have sort of the one dimension. And look, we're getting to why I'm here, which is my tour de force about how great the NBA is right now, how great this season has been, how incredible the play has been, the tactics, the strategy, and there's been, of course, all this chatter that has been building, really coming to almost a boiling point this season with how the old days used to be better and everyone just shoots threes and plays defense. And we can talk about that more in a second. This is the real reason why I'm here. But when you get to Oklahoma City, Kevin, you have a team that to me is from the future. And that's why I have a hard time with your original question of like, does KP and the full strength Celtics, returning the roster, all the experience, the top 7 or 8 players, are they the clear favorites? The answer is no to me, because Mark Daigneault does an incredible job on offense and defense, exploiting and manipulating space and tactics. And I just think they play on the cutting edge. And when you look at that defense, we did a video earlier in the year, some of the things they're doing. Let me give you an example. Starting in a zone and going to man in the middle of a possession. I mean, this is really, really high level stuff. And the Celtics will do really high level stuff as well. We documented it in some videos at the end of their season last year as they culminated with the championship. Both of these teams have a lot of high IQ players. Drew Holiday, Al Horford. They know how to do things like peel switch, which are very modern, advanced tactics that players are kind of feeling out on the fly. You can practice it sometimes, but you need to be smart. You need to understand position and you need to understand role. And another one, you might have seen this if you're watching at home and you kind of close your eye and use your mind's eye. The Thunder will sprint a bunch of players around the court at the end of quarters and at certain possessions. You'd be like, what's going on? Is this a football? Is this like a pre-snap formation in football where like 4 guys are sprinting around? They often do stuff like that against zones to sort of force the defense to show a hand and where they're going to be. And just all the way down the line, I just think they're very progressive in how they play, and I think it gives them an edge.
I mean, your Oklahoma City video was absolutely tremendous. That was, I think, back in December, January, and they have just continued to thrive while also adding back Chet Holmgren, and now they're playing with 2 bigs. And
what are they, 53-8 when they have a center? I think 53-8 with Chet or Isaiah Hartenstein, who's been an incredible pickup for them and gives them playmaking. And while we're on it, they do have the highest margin of victory in NBA history as of right now, higher than the 96 Bulls, the 72 Lakers, the 67 76ers, the 86 Celtics, the 16 Golden State Warriors. The 17 Golden State Warriors. It doesn't matter. So it's really an incredible regular season for them.
I want to get your take on this, Ben, because it relates to Oklahoma City. The NBA will be sending out award ballots pretty soon, possibly as soon as next week once April hits. And, lately, Draymond Green has been really advocating for himself to win Defensive Player of the Year. Of course, Wemby's not eligible. He's out, not reaching 65 games. Grizzlies falling off a cliff. Bye-bye to Jaren Jackson Jr. in that discussion right now. And Draymond has become the favorite for Defensive Player of the Year. On BetMGM, he's a minus 165. He's leading in odds over Evan Mobley, who's fallen to number 2 at plus 150. Then you get Dyson Daniels, Lou Dort, and then Jaren Jackson's on there as well still. Now with Draymond, obviously a tremendous defender, but you see Lou Dort down there at number 4. And I find it interesting that it was only 3 years ago, Marcus Smart wins Defensive Player of the Year, who was great defensively, but he won it in part because Boston had the number 1 defense in the league. And Smart was kind of the leader of that team, the representative of what was a great team defense. And defense is about 5, not 1. With Oklahoma City, is there a case to be made for Lou Dort or somebody else in that team to be the winner of that award? Or do you still think about it more as an individual accolade? Or should we be rewarding OKC for what they're doing?
I think of it as an individual accolade. Yeah. And not to
so
say
you wouldn't, select the Dort then. You'd reward them with all defensive team nominations, multiple guys getting on one of those 2 teams.
Yeah, I think they do. I think they have multiple all defensive players on the team. I've said this before. I think they have the best collection of hands in NBA history. Now, I mean, speaking of narratives and chatter, there's a lot of chatter about, their fouling situation in Oklahoma City. We just did a recent video on Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who I think is both incredible and then also at times moves into an area of sort of grifting or foul baiting, trying to hook an arm or something like that. And I've been very vocal in the past about, I think it's the league's job and the officiating sort of MO to stamp that out of the game entirely. I'd love to see that. But the other side of that, Kevin, is people say, well, the Thunder defense fouls a lot. And it's like, first of all, they literally do foul a lot. They're amongst the league leaders in fouling. They're very aggressive and they're small and they commit a ton of fouls. But they also have this amazing collection of players that A, get in passing lanes, and B, get their hands on balls. And when you look at the replay or you look at different camera angles, 90% of the time it's clean. So it's like they do foul in the literal sense, but I don't know if they're actually getting away with more. It's more that they just have Lou Dort, who's got good hands. Alex Caruso has crazy good hands. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who gets in passing lanes. Jalen Williams, they have two Jalen Williams, but let's talk about J-Dub. He, to me, has probably been the most important defender for them for most of the season. And yet when he goes out, their defense is still fantastic. Chet Holmgren might have been the most traditional sort of defensive player of the year candidate. They didn't necessarily need Chet Holmgren. They played most of the season without him and had one of the great defenses we've seen in recent years. So to me, I like still leaning toward the best individual defender in the season. And I don't know if that player, I don't think that player comes from OKC.
So there's not a case for J-Dub then?
Well, I think you can, these awards sometimes get a little nebulous. Do you get a ballot? Do they send you a ballot to vote on this stuff?
Yeah, so they email you asking, would you like to participate in this year's award voting? You respond and you say yes or no. And then about a week later, they send you an email with a exclusive link that you then insert your votes into.
And what is the criteria that they give you for Defensive Player of the Year?
I think it's just, the basic line, the Defensive Player of the Year, the Hakeem Olajuwon Award represents the best defensive player of the 2024-2025 NBA season. Like a real basic line. Like
so that's kind of fuzzy. It's kind of ambiguous. Yes, and I think that applies to a lot of these top awards. And I'm not saying there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but there's a lot of wiggle room in how much you want to say, right? I want to lean into this narrative. I want to lean into
Which is why it could be some years Marcus Smart, or this year like Dyson Daniels will get votes, even though the Hawks have the 17th, ranked defense, because he's amazing individually.
Yeah. I for me, it would still be one of the traditional. I think some of the bigs you mentioned, Jaren Jackson Jr., Evan Mobley, guys like that. I think that those would be the guys I would look at
over
at
Draymond.
The end of the year. Draymond's there as well. I think with Draymond, I can't remember what year it was. It might have been 2022, and he missed a ton of games. I mean, there have been years in the past where I look at his season and I just go, he's the best defender in the NBA from game 1 to June. When you take the totality of the playoffs and the matchups and the versatility and the communication and the intelligence, we've done a lot of video content on him. I think he's one of the greatest defenders of all time. This year, he's a little bit older. I don't think he's having quite the season he had 2 or 3 years ago. I think it's great that he's in the conversation, but I wouldn't necessarily look at him as like, if you sent me that ballot, I don't know if he'd be the first guy to pop into my head.
I agree with you there. And I do tend to lean towards your perspective here that it still is an individual award. You can reward a team with those all defensive teams by having multiple guys on it. And one of the guys that belongs there, and I'm surprised, hasn't, at least gotten more conversation, Bronny Camara, who you made an excellent video about over on Thinking of Basketball. And with him, the reason why he's not part of the conversation is because the raw numbers just don't pop. 1.5 steals per game, 0.7 blocks per game. It's unlike Dyson Daniels, who's racking up a ton of steals. You made a whole video about him, even called him kind of like a modern Scottie Pippen. What is it that makes Camara such a spectacular special defender, Ben?
I think you're just trying to whisper sweet somethings into my ear with all these fun and exciting players and guys we've been able to do video content on. I think what we started with was this idea of he's like a baby Pippen. because Scottie Pippen himself, during his heyday, was one of the great perimeter defenders of all time. And Camara is an emerging player who I would not put in that category, but he's a very, very good defender right now. And to your point about traditional stats like blocks or steals, he's way out in front in offensive fouls drawn. And one of the things we track for our members at patreon.com/thinkingbasketball is forced turnovers. Right. So we're not just caring about steals or deflections or things like that. And you actually start to see, okay, there's at least one statistical signal that this guy's a pest and he doesn't necessarily block all the shots. Why doesn't he block as many shots? Because half the time he's deployed in that sentinel role of like, go out and take away the head of the snake. Go guard the point of attack. Stop the ball handler. You might be 6'7" or 6'8", but we want you on Damian Lillard tonight, and you're going to completely ruin Damian Lillard's night. Then you go into the next game, and they might ask you to guard Nikola Jokic. And so sometimes I think that can get lost in some of these. We don't have great tools for measuring defense, but the tools that we have can be very blunt force. And a guy like that can get lost in the shuffle. And I don't know, again, if he's like at the top 3 finalist defensive player of the year level, but he's had a great defensive season. And I think he can continue to even get better defensively in Portland.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's only his second year and absolutely excellent. The positioning, the IQ, the feel, the effort level, constantly bringing effort. And, with effort, like LeBron recently, granted he was out for a little while, but with LeBron recently, it's just amazing to see, with a player at his level, with his stature, the difference between his performance defensively when you have that flip switched, when you were just merely hustling and playing intent basketball on defense versus when you're not. Like, hustle and effort is really the primary ingredient to successful defense. I think when it comes, right?
I think it's a must-have for most players as a starting point. And if you don't have that as a starting point, you often start giving away value. You start bleeding value. And I think you see this sometimes with fan bases who get very angry about the coach for playing certain players. Let's stick with the Lakers, right? I think Jordan Goodwin just signed a proper deal with the Lakers. He's given them great minutes because he's working really hard. He's providing a ton of effort. And when you do that, you're in the right positions often. And you're not creating leaks or gaps that the offense can attack. And as you said at the top, with defense being 5 players instead of 1 player, when there's no weaknesses, now all of a sudden the floor for your defense goes way up. Before we leave it, by the way, the other thing about Toumani Camara that I think is very interesting is his background and the way he's played and where he played and his very, very interesting background. And so I think he has more room to develop offensively. And we've seen that this season. And I don't know what that looks like down the road, but a player like that, he was like the 52nd pick. You sort of get pigeonholed into this, like, can he be a defensive specialist? But I actually think athletically and with some of his skills, he can blossom into a very interesting all-around kind of player in the next few years.
Camara offensively is interesting because he played at Dayton. And with him, they used him in so many different roles offensively. Like, you'd see him, running DHOs as a passer. You'd see him rolling to the basket. You'd see him as a catch and shoot guy. The defensive versatility was pretty clear with him. I don't think, you would have projected him to be what he is already in year 2, but they used him in different places on the floor as a screener, as a handler, and everything else. So with Portland, it's kind of Denny Avdia, who is this unbelievable versatile weapon for the Blazers. But Camara did some of that in college. And so, like, one of the reasons why I like covering the draft is because you kind of see these guys in their infancy, and then you're like, okay, well, let's remember that for down the line. And with Camara, I think you're nailing it there, Ben. You see hints of it, and I wonder if over the course of time, that's something that grows with him. And then suddenly, not only is he this great defensive player, but he becomes a real great versatile offensive player more than what he's asked to do right now. Because it took until year 5 for Denny made great progress last year, his 4th year, his final year with the Wizards. But this year is where he's made immense progress. Development is not a linear thing. And for Camara, it could be year 4 or year 5 where we're seeing exactly what you're hitting on.
Well, I think he's talked about it a little bit and how you're shifting the role and you're kind of being put in a different position and now people are thinking you can't do certain stuff that maybe you could do when you were younger at a lower level, and you're kind of unearthing that again. In his case, you start to see, okay, he can attack closeouts well, he can spot up and hit shots well, but he actually can handle the ball and move pretty well. It goes back to the baby Pippen thing. Like, he can get downhill, he can move. He has decent instincts as a passer, even though that's not really a thing you look at and say, like, here's this defensive player. Is he a great passer? Transition, he can start doing things. So I think there's a lot of space there to grow, and it's a very interesting thing when you think about prospects and that like nonlinear growth curve that you mentioned.
Well, speaking about prospects, of the rookies this year, who would you take number one in a redraft today?
Boy, I don't know. The reason why that's a hard question is I feel like there are a lot of rookies in this class that are kind of in a similar tier, if you will. Like, I'm not sure if I look at a prospect in this class, unless I'm totally blanking on a prospect right now, which I've been known to do. You know, if you've ever listened to the Thinking Basketball podcast, you'd know that I don't know what's going on half the time. But do you have a number of guys from Stephon Castle? So obviously one of the first guys that jumped out to me. I loved him right when I saw him, I think in Summer League all the way back. You have a guy like that, and you kind of look at where he is as a player and where you think he could grow into, and then you compare it to some of the other players in the class, and it's like, would I take him number one? Maybe, but I feel like there are other players in a sort of similar tier. I'm not sure anyone necessarily jumps out to me. By the way, when you do draft stuff, do you sort of tier players like that in your head? Do you?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So
sure.
Similarly, like, you know,
yes.
Sometimes you have a draft where the tier, like Victor Wembanyama, it's a tier of one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Or
so
this year, like
I'm not sure
Cooper Flag like is on a level of his own, and then you could argue Dylan Harper is on a level of his own after that. But then after that, it's like, well, 3 to 10, 3 to 11, or 3 to 12, all a big group where it's like, you know, maybe certain teams you have one guy number 3, and then other teams you have him number 10. And to your point, that's also true with the rookies today. Some teams might want Risache. Some teams might want Castle. Some teams might still want Reed Shepherd. Like Houston, I don't think Houston would move off of Reed Shepherd as their top ranked prospect, which he was.
Yeah, I mean, where I was going with this is when you have a draft class like this historically that doesn't necessarily have that like group or one player at the top of the tier, sometimes it takes a couple years for this development to take off. And then you look back 4, 5, 6 years later and you go, oh, I didn't expect that 22nd pick to actually be the clear-cut all-star from this draft. And maybe Reed Shepherd is a great example of that, although I don't think he'd be my answer for who I'd take number one in a redraft. But, you know, like, think of a guy like Dillingham. He's kind of had like flashes during the season, but he's not really in a position with that team and the way that team is built to get 30 minutes a game, to get a ton of reps, to get a ton of development. So you could see in a different situation or down the line, like, whoa, all of a sudden here comes Rob Dillingham. I mean, go back to Scoot last year. Now, Scoot Henderson, of course, was a very highly touted prospect who then struggled a little bit relative to where he was. But look at that growth arc. He's on a team where they still believe in him. They're investing in him. They're giving him a ton of reps. And all of a sudden, in the last 2 or 3 months, you're starting to see this exponential growth as he catches up to the speed and physicality of the NBA game, starts to kind of get his reads and his rhythm. And now all of a sudden, you're like, oh, okay, that's the Scoot that the prospects and the draftniks were so excited about.
Ben, I have to ask for everybody that's listening to this podcast.
Don't do it.
When are you making a breakdown video of Bronny James?
I told you that in confidence, Kevin. I told you we were not going to make a big announcement about this. No, I don't know. When Bronny James does something, he's like every other player. He gets the same rules as every other player. When he does something that catches our eye, despite the demand for clicks, he still has to perform for us.
Well, I mean, let me tell you what. I know, like, you're not the type. You never make videos really about clicks or anything like that. Here's the interesting thing. Here's what has stood out, though. I think a Bronny James thinking basketball video would be fascinating for this reason, because is he a real NBA prospect? In what ways has he improved? Or the critics right? Like, there's some big questions here about him. And with him, like, you talk about improvement since Christmas, 36.2% from three in NBA and G League combined, 84.6% from the free throw line. And those numbers are important for him because he sucked shooting at USC. He struggled shooting in high school as well. The reason why I wrote a whole article last year about him is because like everybody talks about him as some shooter. He wasn't a shooter, but he's starting to shoot. So I'd be curious of a thinking basketball investigation into all that. I think it would be amazing. It would be really interesting. And I think people would like it from you, but I know you're going to instead be focused a lot on the Lakers, the real Lakers come postseason time, because they've had a bit of a skid as of late. Besides, I mean, they had a great win over the Pacers earlier this week, and we're recording this before they faced the Bulls, who they got beat by 31 this last weekend. They've been down defensively, Ben, but they've also faced a lot of like fast, up and down, fast-paced teams. I'm curious how you kind of assess this March basketball, like how real is it versus how you project them come April, and they would hope into May as a team that is going to be slowing things down, playing through Luka, through Reeves, through LeBron. How do you assess this recent skid versus how you project them forward?
It's so funny. We literally did our last podcast episode on what in the world is real in March, because, this is a thing that from Quentin Grimes' outbursts to the Bulls win streak to sort of the Lakers up and down. We always have this in March, but this year it feels spectacularly sort of wild and unpredictable. And how much do you make of this? The takeaway that I have is like, there's always a lot of signal in March, but there's more noise. And you have to figure out what that noise is. And when the Lakers, it's compounded by the trade. I don't know if you know this, Kevin. Luka Doncic was traded from Dallas. Yeah.
Really?
Have you heard about that? Yes, he was traded from Dallas to the Lakers at some point in the night on a Friday. And you have that. But there are other things with the Lakers as well. Their defense started to turn the corner in like January. And they also had moving parts there as well, because it's hard to go back and think this far back in time, but they had like D'Angelo Russell on the team to start the year and things like that. So the addition of Dorian Finney-Smith was massive for them defensively. Gabe Vincent comes back. He had the injury. So all of a sudden you start like adding one defender after another defender after another defender. Jared Vanderbilt comes back from injury. Anthony Davis leaves the equation at some point. Not even because of that trade I was telling you about that you probably didn't know about, but because of the injury. And they still played really well without Davis even before the trade. And then you integrate Luka, and then you have LeBron James, another moving part, 40 years old, all of a sudden starts to pick up his play. Like I'm asking myself, is this the best offensive play I've seen from LeBron in 3 years, in 4 years, in 5 years? What is going on? Then he gets injured. And now I think at his age, you have to account for the rust as well. So I'm not necessarily punting on your question. I'm not necessarily stalling. I'm saying when I look at the Lakers, I still don't quite know what to make of it, because take their defense just statistically. It was the best defense in the league for over a month. And then you look at the numbers and you go, well, opponents' three-point open shooting against them was way below where we'd expect it to be by like a ton. They would have gone from like the best defense to maybe like a middle of the pack defense, something like that. And as an analyst, I go, okay, that makes sense to me, because what JJ Redick is trying to do is he's trying to play with this smaller lineup. He's trying to play with 2 or 3 defensive weaknesses. They want to switch. They want to shrink the floor. They want to dare you to make threes. And so sometimes you're going to have open shots and miss them, and sometimes you're going to make them. Well, to make it more complicated, like you look at the Bulls game the other night, the Bulls made all of those open threes, Kevin. What, they had like 19 threes in that game. I think they shot 47% from downtown. So turnovers from the offense lead to more open shots, leads to the threes going in. All this is to say, I'm still kind of hedging my bets and saying, I think the Lakers can be mediocre defensively, and that's kind of all they need to be if they can figure out the offense with LeBron James and Luka Doncic, because who else is going to have 2 top 10 offensive players on their team, to say nothing of Austin Reeves, who's probably the 3rd best offensive player in the league on a team.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I'm interested in your last comment there, Ben. I think you're spot on. You're not hedging necessarily. It's just true. Like it's hard to get an assessment there. And they're also a new team. Chemistry does matter. So we'll see how quickly they gel. But the last thing you said regarding they only need to be about average if they figure out the offense. Have you seen enough signs so far to feel that they could be figuring out their offense? You did mention Reeves, potentially the third best offensive player for
the
a team.
best third best offensive player.
The best.
Yeah.
And LeBron playing some of the best offense of his life post Luka trade. Is that enough? Or are you still looking to see more over the final few weeks here?
Well, I think if it was of his life, going back into like when he was in his 20s.
Sorry, yes. I have a last 3-4 years.
No, but it's funny because I think if it was of his life, then I would be like, okay, I think they're in good shape. I've seen enough to still have the tingle. I've seen enough to still say, okay, when you stack up the other, when you stack up the other teams, they still have a bit more of a puncher's chance. But I am concerned. I do still think it's matchup dependent. I think there's some good matchups for them in the West, and then I think there's other matchups where I'm like, oh, okay, that's going to be an interesting series. I'm not exactly sure how that shakes out. And the thing about these matchup, style makes the fights tournament is you can win one of them. Sometimes you can win two of them. But when you have to win 3 or 4 of them, it starts to become mathematically harder and harder, especially if the third one is Oklahoma City.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned Quentin Grimes as well. It's funny with him, like 27, 5-5 this month on a high volume, shooting 40% from 3, on ball, off ball, thriving in every way. But then you get Georges Niang talking trash with him. He's like, you'll be back in the corner with Joel and Tyrese back. And Niang, big trash talker, because back in, I think it was February, he was talking with Paolo Banchero, and he's like, keep shooting the mid-range, keep shooting the mid-range. So Niang, I mean, I don't know if he set off Banchero. I don't know if it was me. I doubt it was me, but I got Magic fans in my mentions every single day because on a podcast after the deadline, I asked the question, are we sure Paolo Banchero was good? He was really struggling at the time. The team was performing significantly better without him. But he's been tremendous. Last 13 games during Thursday night, 31 points per game, 62.9% true shooting the hell out of it from 3 at almost 40%, over 80% from the free throw line. He's been great. Now, it's March, and to your point about team performance and player performance, are you seeing signs of an uptick in real sustainable performance from Paolo, or are you still feeling, small sample here, let's calm down a bit?
I know what you're trying to do. You are trying to get those Magic fans out of your mentions and into my mentions.
Directing them to at LG.
No, I am not going to take the bait. They are not going to come over to Thinking Basketball and flood my mentions. They're going to stay right here. That was a good try, Kevin. I mean, 13 games. The thing about Paolo that I will say is that sometimes the stuff that is enticing about him both gets him in trouble, but then gives him hot streaks. And so we had the same thing at the beginning of the year in the first 4 or 5 games. Now, in the first 4 or 5 games, I think I was a little bit more hopeful. Hey, it's a new year. Maybe some of the decision-making and the Magic offense is more imbalance. But when you can make really hard shots and you can take all these hard shots and you're giant and bigger than everyone, you can handle the ball and you have this tantalizing talent. That's why I've likened him to certain players in the past that have tantalizing talent that maybe make an all-star team or are solid players, but never really get into that like, hey, this is a 10-time all-star. This is, we think of Derek Coleman as like an all-time legend or something like that. So he has a ton of talent, but, the flip side, Kevin, is you can have a hot streak, but when you look at the end of the year and you're like 38% on those shots, you can't survive in the NBA anymore. Making 38% on your mid-range shots if you take a ton of mid-range shots. You have to make them at 45 or 50% or whatever, and then you have to then know how to play them off of the other things in your arsenal. If the defense loads up on that, you use it for playmaking. If the defense comes and pressures you, you get to the basket more. And that's sort of where I'm still not sold, let's put it that way, because I don't want to get the full Magic mentions, but I'll just leave it at that.
Well, I mean, I think with Paolo, it's impressive to see this stretch here. He looks more like the player that I hoped that he would be when I had him ranked number 1 in his draft class. So I'm optimistic, but at the same time, I do want to see him sustain this and have some more great games against some great teams. We'll take a quick break, Ben, and then when we're back, we're going to talk about one of the best pieces of NBA content of the season. All right, Ben, one of the best little videos or long videos. It was over 20 minutes.
I think it was 24 minutes, but yes,
it was
little
long
for you. Yes.
Little for me. I consume so much content, but it's pretty long, 24, 25 minutes. You've published a video back in, I think, January or so. What former players get completely wrong about today's NBA? And in the description of that video, you wrote, why are there so many three-pointers today? Is the modern NBA game too repetitive? Do all teams really play the same way? This detailed film breakdown and scouting report compares 1990s NBA basketball to the 2000s to today's modern NBA. Everybody should go watch that. But for the listeners who haven't yet and are going to watch it after they listen to this podcast, can you give kind of the Spark Notes summary of some of your thoughts and takeaways that you include in that video to help inform our discussion?
Well, one, I wanted to compare games without curating anything. That was, as I sort of thought about this discussion, which, as I mentioned earlier, has grown and kind of reached a fever pitch of like back in my day, or, the 90s had this, or I missed the mid-range, I missed the post-up. The other big one that video doesn't directly address, although it indirectly addresses it at basically every turn, is the complaint about no one playing defense anymore. And we've done a ton of content on the evolution of offense, but also the evolution of defense. And we have more content coming up in the future as a teaser on the evolution of defense and sort of this. And that's the thing, Kevin. To me, the video aside, we can go back to the video in a second, but one of the impetuses for me is this is one of the great stories in sports history, man. We have a sport that's 120 years old. The league is 65, 70 years old. There's been a line drawn on the court for over 30 years that all of a sudden people start to realize, like, no, wait a second. That line actually gives us an extra point. We get 150% more scoring when we use that line. And the goal of the game is to outscore your opponent. And it's not simply, I think a lot of fans think, oh, they figured out the line. The analytics nerds came in. They were crunching the numbers. They had the computers out. Go take more threes, whatever it is. That's how people online make fun of the analytics nerds in my head. And they didn't just stand there and launch threes. It was the threat of shooting the three and having it be so valuable that changed all these other things downstream. And it's been one of the most unbelievable stories to watch unfold because there's tactical change after tactical change after tactical change, and it set off an arms race where you go, okay, we need more shooters on the court. And then defenses, and this is where you go to like Oklahoma City this year. Well, maybe we need more speed on the court. How do we combat that? Look at a zone. Zones weren't even allowed for decades when we had the illegal defense rules, which were, that was a fun part of the video to go back and have to, in the 90s game, remind people of what's happening with the illegal defense. Like, oh, actually, that defender is not allowed to move below that line on the court if there's another offensive player above this other line on one side of the court when the ball's on the other side of the court.
Incredible.
Absolutely incredible that we did this for 20 years. So when we came out of that, zone was still very much thought of this like lazy thing that you do. Colleges and high schools run zone, and the zone is what's the way to beat a zone, Kevin? What do they all say? We have to outshoot the zone. That's how we get the team to come out of a zone. You look at what's happened just with zone defenses recently. They basically are evolved to take away the three. They're like stretching to the perimeter. They're literal, it's called no three zones in certain basketball circles. And so there's this ton of back and forth arms race going on with all these stories. One of the videos we're working on right now, I'll give a spoiler. I just basically call it the Giannis offense, right? This is a style of play and a subset of offense that didn't exist until a couple of years ago. Your big man getting the ball at midcourt and your team trying to manipulate the spacing so he can play in isolation. And what's the defense going to do? You're going to build a wall, or are you going to counter against this? What if we take a guard and we flip the entire offense? We have the center bring the ball up, and we have a guard set the screen. We have an inverted pick and roll. We get him downhill that way. There's all these things going on. I just feel like those stories aren't being told. And that was kind of the biggest passion point for making the video.
Which, I mean, what you're hitting on ultimately is kind of my issue that people have when they say, well, I remember watching teams that had, a definition to them. The Showtime Lakers running and gunning up the floor, and the 90s Knicks dragging teams down to the mud. It's like,
nobody complained about that ever. Yeah.
And there are teams nowadays that have their own style.
I think there's plenty of teams that have their own style. Now, it always ebbs and flows. I think some years you have more distinct. A couple of years ago when this complaint came, it was like, okay, the Nuggets play one totally unique way. The Warriors play one totally unique way. And then a couple more years go by and maybe teams get a little more similar. But to your point, the players you have also determine what your style is. So the Pelicans offense and the Bucks offense and teams like that, that's going to look different than the Nuggets offense, which is going to look different than the Heat offense. And the Celtics offense is different than all these. And the Thunder offense. So they're all a little bit different, and they're all dictated to some degree by the star. And so I think some of these things are very much overblown. The other thing, did you want to ask me another question?
No, continue.
I think the other thing about the video is that a lot of people, and I love the feedback, because I love seeing feedback like this, because we do a lot of historical content and we do a lot of old content. And I think there's fans.
Your greatest peak series.
Exactly. Yes.
Must watch.
Yes. So they say, I want to watch the game more today. I want to like the game more today, but it's hard for me because I still just see the Celtics chucking 63s and everything kind of looks the same. And when you zoom out a little bit from where people like you and me maybe live every day, you go, okay, it does kind of look the same because pick and roll has replaced the post up. A lot of people run pick and roll, and you see these like 2 and 3 man common actions that every team runs their own version of. Why do they run their own version of that? Because it's unstoppable, because it's extremely difficult to guard. And so there's a language that's picked up and shared tribally around the league where you're like, okay, I understand how we're going to run our version of this play out of the corner with a handoff and yada, yada, yada. So this other big component in the comments was like, I really, really want to watch it, but I just don't see that perspective that you're talking about. And to me, so much of this comes down to how we cover the game and the way we talk about it, and the fact that this arms race has led to a kind of increase in complexity. The thumbnail of that video is too many threes crossed out and replaced by too much complexity, because the speed, the dynamism, and I feel it breaking down film. Like if we had Thinking Basketball 10 years ago and we're breaking down film, the videos would be shorter because there isn't as much going on. And in fact, when we make videos today, we often make decisions internally of like, that's not core to the story of this game, so leave it alone. But if you ask me, what do I see on this play? It might take me 2 minutes to describe everything that's going on in that play. And a lot of things going on in that play have to do with what happened 3 plays ago, or 8 plays ago, or 12 plays ago. And Kevin, that is the reason why we have 3 rows of assistant coaches now, instead of just a head coach and 2 assistant coaches. Everyone has their eyes on everything. Everyone feels like they're smarter about everything. And I think this is sort of I'm very sympathetic to this, because in a way, the more we go down the road of the evolutionary arms race, the more we leave the average fan behind, who was never told. They're just sitting there watching the game and they're like, now, wait a second, what happened to the post-ups?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, I think you're hitting, so the difference between the NFL, NBA, NFL, there's a built-in break between.
Yep, exactly.
Between each play, between the snap and the next snap. There's time for replay, for Tony Romo to come in and use the teleprompter and analyze what's going to happen, for Tom Brady to explain why the quarterback made a mistake or made a great read. There's time for that. The NBA, there's no time for that, first of all. But then you mentioned the complexity of the game. Like inherently, the plays that you're watching are moving faster. It is a much faster paced game than back to the basket post up or, ISO, mid-range pull up. It is a faster game with more happening. The way you talked about Oklahoma City's defense earlier with some of the things they do, the way they perform offensively, the way they attack zones, there's a lot of complexities. Now, I think that's fascinating because the process of how teams get into threes, 42% of shots this year are taken from 3-point range, up from 39.5% last year, a new historic high. No surprise there. The process of how teams get to those threes, I do think There's differences in how teams do that. But the pushback that people have as well, they say it's too much of the same thing. Like, I don't care about how teams are getting to the three. The result of the play, it's almost half the time teams are taking a 3-pointer at the end of the possession. That's where I do think the NBA does need to listen to some of those consumers of the game, where they say it's just, whether it's too complex or the results are too much the same. I do think there's something there. Like, how would you speak to kind of those people who say there's just too much of the same result?
Yeah, I don't think I put the onus on especially the more casual fans who plug into the game in their own way. They have their own relationship with the game that's different than our relationship with the game. Because, as for instance, if you're at a bar and it's Sunday afternoon and you're watching football, you can watch most of the plays during the football game and have a pretty good feel for what's going on because of the breaks you're talking about, because of the telestration. Heck, they don't even show all the players in football on the camera. Right? They're just like, trust us. There's stuff going on off camera. We're not going to give you the Madden view. Just trust us. In basketball, one of the things that has happened over the years that I've been very sensitive to breaking down film is the camera's gotten farther and farther and farther zoomed out because we have to capture all the space. You go watch a game in the 90s, and in some arenas, it feels like you're courtside. You can't even see past like the foul line. They're so zoomed in. They're like, hey, we're going to the post. Bernard King has the ball in the post. Michael Jordan has the ball at the elbow. Throw it in, and you can feel the sweat hit the camera lens. And the kind of zoomed out version, it's like sitting in the nosebleeds. It makes it feel a little bit slower. It makes it feel a little less exciting. You don't get to appreciate how insane the athletes are. I mean, they're aliens, Kevin. Go take someone and sit courtside at an NBA game and see if they're not transfixed.
Dude,
because
it's such a different experience when you're close to the court. It's insane.
It's unreal that they're human beings and that they can do this. It's absolutely incredible. And I think that's part of the magic of the sport. And so I very much sympathize with that, because today, if you're at a bar and you try to follow a game, I mean, heck, man, when we do videos on games, we have to pause and rewind the game repeatedly. And I do this for a living, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. I can't imagine trying to do, like, out of the corner of my eye, have a normal social gathering, order a drink, and then be like, oh, what happened? Oh, what happened was there were 6 threes. Yeah, there were 6 threes attempted.
I can't watch games with friends unless it's a game I don't need to watch. If it's a game I need to watch, I'm alone.
but it also goes back to the point about stuff at the end of the possession, where how do you bridge that gap as just a typical average person? You either look at the box score, or you go like, well, wait a second. Okay, he hit a 3, he missed a 3, he missed a 3, he hit a 3. What? All they do is shoot. Derek White, all he does is come down and shoot from the wing. That's all he does. And it's very easy to miss that like 7 to 11 seconds that led to the 3. We had one of my favorite videos just on a single game that we ever did. You'll probably remember this game. Was a couple years ago. The Kings and the Clippers played like a 176 to 175 game in overtime. And that game was insane. And one of the hallmarks of breaking down that game was the speed off of made baskets, creating mismatch problems. So the Clippers make a jumper. The Kings pull the ball right out of the hoop, start moving it down the court. And now the Clippers are like, well, wait a second. The guy who made the basket's over on the other side of the court. I have to match over here. You have to match over here. So it's a 3-on-2 just on this short side of the court. I have to pick between giving a layup and a 3. Kings hit a 3. Clippers get the ball. They come down the court. The exact same dynamic going the other way. And I think in that video, there's a sequence of like 4 made layups and 3s within like 15 seconds. And I just can't imagine trying to process that without being able to at least pause and rewind and get some assistance from the broadcast.
Yes. And ultimately, you can't unless there's a timeout called. And when there's a timeout call, there's a commercial.
And what do fans complain about? There are too many timeouts.
Too many timeouts.
So we're stuck.
It's a very difficult problem for the NBA.
I have a solution. I just thought of this, so take it with a grain of salt. I'm not a huge fan of replay, but they still have replay. I think if they're going to have replay, they should have it, like another ref in the replay center in New York or something. I think it's funny that the refs always grade their own papers. I love NBA refs, but it cracks me up. They're like, I'm going to go see if I got this call right. And they're like, they
look at the camera.
Right. Yeah. They look at the replay. They're like, my call could have been, I could see it. I could see how this could be a good call. We're not going to change the call. maybe during the replays, which fans always complain about, they take 2 minutes, they take 3 minutes. That's a dedicated time where we can go back and get some X's and O's to figure out what the heck just happened in the last couple minutes of play.
Yes, I mean, a great idea for any NBA broadcast. Instead of showing the replay over and over and over, show it once, and then you don't have to show it again. We'll see the result. When you get the result, that's the opportunity to have your package ready, breaking down what happened in the game. That's tough though. Like for these broadcasts, they would need more Ben Taylors to be working on these broadcasts. What
are you suggesting?
I mean, if we clone you, that's my suggestion. Clone 30 of you, one for each team.
If you let me know how to do that, I would be the first person. Yeah.
I mean, I would love to see some of that. I mean, I think halftime shows as well. There's more that can be done there with breaking down first halves of games. It's tough. I mean, because like you said, it's a fast moving game. Things can change quickly. You can go from a close game to a blowout suddenly. And like, it's tough from a broadcast perspective as well. I don't want to act like it's easy to have a 2 minute, 3 minute breakdown ready, but that's where, your color commentator, if he's equipped to do that, he can break down something that happened a few minutes prior to educate fans. Like, I think there's simple things he can do and be ready to do from a pre-show production aspect.
Yeah, no, this is why I'm very sympathetic to fans on this issue and feel like instead of talking down to them, there's just work, because a lot of fans earnestly love the game, but it feels disconnected from the game they watched in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, 2012, 2013. And it's like, yeah, back then at halftime, we had analysts and X's and O's and analysis of the game. And now we have like a 27-second halftime where someone gives a quick hot take and they go back to a couple more commercials. It's a totally different experience in terms of the way the game is presented.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, that's what I think the NBA, Adam Silver, needs to hammer down about. Like, when it comes to the fan experience, you can talk all you want about rule changes, this and that, blah, 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 blah. But when it comes to the broadcast itself, I can't wait to see what Amazon and NBC, I love the hires that they've made for both networks so far. I'm really optimistic about what those networks can do when it comes to making the game super digestible. Like, that's what I like about what you do with your channel. It's digestible for anybody, whether they're a coach or whether there's somebody just trying to get into the game to learn, but also be entertained. Like, that's always my goal with this pod. It's always my goal when I write the draft guide. It's about entertaining and informing. And I think for the broadcast, it's tough. Like a lot of people, they have different styles of entertainment. Some people are all in on the Stephen A. Smith versus LeBron James drama, which I'm sure you are one of them. But there are other people who are not. And I know you woke up this morning and watched First Take, Ben. I'm sure you did, right?
I just put it on loop. Can't get enough of it. That's how I get out of bed. That's how I get energy in the morning. Have you had Adam Silver on this podcast?
No, but I'd love to have Adam on.
Okay.
I would love to.
I think you got to get him on and, talk to him about this. I think the people will like it.
Do you think one thing when the 3-point rate though, Ben, I mentioned it's 42% right now. Do you personally think there's a happy medium for 3-point rate? Are there certain, do you think it should be ideally in the NBA's eyes shifted down a bit?
The thing that I feel like is missed in that conversation is the defense determines what the 3-point rate is to a large degree. Offenses are going to try to put their best shooters out there, their best players out there, and so on and so forth. But if the defense wants to take away threes more, they're potentially going to get carved up with layups and other stuff closer to the basket.
Yes.
We talked about the Celtics and Kristaps Porzingis earlier. One of the things they do so well is they screen, they create the switch and the mismatch with the screen. They go to the post. And then if you don't double team, Kristaps Porzingis is going to eat down there. And if you do double team, the Celtics are going to move the ball around. They're going to swing it around. They're going to get this beautiful ball movement, find an open three. Back in my day, Kevin, that was celebrated when you passed the ball around the horn 5 times and you hit a shot. But no, it's really about how the defense can respond. And so if defenses can find a way to kind of somehow guard both better, maybe some of the officiating sort of edicts and points of emphasis can allow a little more. This year, I think it's been great with the physicality. They've allowed defenders to mostly exist. But the other thing is like moving screens, right? I think Rick Barry once famously said, I watched a game and there were 67 moving screens. And I'm not even sure he got past like halftime or something. So maybe stuff like that, where it's like, okay, if I give the defense more of a chance to survive, then the defense is still determining what's the best shot for the offense. And right now, if you're still toggling between layups and threes as an extreme, good defenses are always going to pick layups. And that's why you're going to have 30-something% of your threes or 40-something% of your threes, or shots, I should say, be from the 3-point line. So I think there's a medium, but I really think it has to do with how successfully defenses can kind of guard. We used to have one really high value
rule changes though too, because you mentioned defense dictated, but rule changes as well.
Absolutely.
You talked about how defense was in the 90s versus the way it is now. Hand checking rules have changed. The way things are officiated are changing. Like you said, there is more physicality allowed, hand checking and whatnot right now in today's NBA. What about with rule changes?
Yeah, well, there's some things I don't think we can ever put back in the bag, like the gather step. The gather step has given so much freedom to offensive players, and
it's never changing.
It's right; it's never going back. And you get great moves off the gather step, but that combined with all the space that the shooting has created makes it very difficult to guard in isolation. It makes it very difficult to guard without sending help. You start sending help to take away layups and shots at the basket. The counter is the three, because now we have a second high value real estate spot where a 40% 3-point shooter is a 60% 2-point shooter. And that used to kind of be a gold standard where it's like, hey man, Shaq, you just get him really close to the hoop, he can make like 60% of his 2-point shots. And as we said in our Shai Gilgeous-Alexander video, he's making 58% of his 2-point shots as a guard. And of course, that's a testament to his extraordinary skill, but that's the math game you're playing defensively. You're constantly trying to figure that out. And so I think when you toggle, when the choices are like, oh man, we got to do everything we can to prevent this guy from getting to the basket for a layup or force a kick out, any good defense is going to take the layup, 9 times out of 10, depending on the shooters.
Is there a rule change you'd make?
Moving screens is the obvious one to tighten up for me. I don't think we'll ever go back to the 70s when you just had to stand there like a statue for 5 seconds to set a screen. But I will say this, Kevin, there are a lot of moving screens that are the definition of a moving screen by today's standards, meaning, like, as a simple example, you're not supposed to have your legs spread 6 feet apart when you set a screen. That should just be a no-brainer. Guys getting up into players' spaces when they didn't give them space to set a screen. I think those kinds of moving screens should be a no-brainer. And I think the reason why that simple idea would be where I start is because, man, defenders want to hustle. They want to fight now. They want to play now. Alex Caruso, Lou Dort, these guys, Derek White, Drew Holiday, they want to get over screens. Give them a chance on that action, because coaches have figured out, if I set a pick, it's like a built-in advantage regardless of who the defense is. And I think that's something that could maybe shore it up and help defenses sort of stem the tide.
It's interesting because one of the, it's not a primary complaint. When people complain about the NBA today, they complain about grifting and fouls and timeouts and too many threes. But one of the minor complaints you see people say is, well, there's just switching everything. It's just always a switch. Teams aren't hustling, this and that. But to your point, defenses do want to hustle. The idea that teams aren't defending or allowed to defend now isn't true. But one of the ways that they are prevented of defending they want to, or to the ability that they can, is because of the moving screens. And I think that's a good place to start. It's very simple as well. It's really just enforcing the rule as it's written to a greater extreme. And then maybe teams, switch a little bit less. You see more fighting over, you see more great hustle plays. And maybe that over the course of time could help win back some of those fans who have this belief, which, that's their opinion, and, they're right to feel that way.
I'm glad I've sold you on this, at least.
I like that idea. I do. It's a simple one because it's already an existing rule. It's just about enforcing that rule.
It feels like there are things. The other simple one, although I don't think it's going to be as big of a deal, is traveling. I would love to see, they miss a lot of travels, but they almost never call travels that aren't travels. And I think there's like this existential fear of calling a travel that's not a travel. And so when you never want to have a false positive, you get a lot of false negative. You get like, okay, all right, that's a travel. We're not going to call it. I don't think that would have as big of an impact on the moving screen thing. But my point here is there are just already rules in place that sometimes the league in the off season, or you make a big enough stink, you make a lot of noise, and they go and they put their points of emphasis in, and they say, okay, we got to go back and actually execute this rule the way we want it called. And I think that's how we got to where we got with physicality and contact on the outside. Way more contact has been allowed on the outside this year, and I think it's better for the game. And I don't see, fans want that intense physical battle.
What made you first fall in love with basketball?
Kevin, if this were my show, this is when I do my outro and we get out of here, and I dodge the question. I don't know how to dodge this question. Yeah. I think it was the buzzer beater. How about that?
The buzzer beater.
Yeah. That moment at the end of a game where the ball's in the air and the game just hangs in the balance, and the crowd makes it's a very unique sporting noise that the crowd makes when the ball's in the air. And then the culmination of that, if it goes in, especially if it's a 1 or 2 point game, if it's tie and you're going to go overtime, that's one thing. But I think it was the buzzer beater. Yeah.
I got Mike Gorman in my head saying, got it.
Yes.
old Celtics play-by-play announcer.
Well, it probably, the one I really remember was a Larry Bird game against Portland in 1992. The Celtics won the game in double overtime by some goofy score, like 152 to 148 or something like that. But it basically had 2 buzzer beaters. Kevin Gamble hit a mid-range buzzer beater to send it into 1 overtime. And then the Celtics were down, this is how old school basketball works. It's so funny. I think they were down 3. Larry Bird takes this falling over comical 3 with 2 seconds left and hits it. He was clearly inside the line, Kevin. It was clearly a 2-pointer, but on the replay, he was also clearly fouled. And everyone just sort of washed their hands of it at the time. And the broadcasters were like, well, he was fouled, so it would have been a 3-point play anyway. We're good here.
With thinking basketball, Ben, last thing here, you said 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. Do you have time for anything else? What else do you do? What does Ben Taylor, Mr. Thinking Basketball, do in his limited spare time?
I walk my dog, play with her. She demands a certain amount of emotional attention. And then I try to catch up on a TV series or a movie every once in a while, like a White Lotus. I like to go
White Lotus to
a Thailand or a Sicily or something like that.
Sensational. I'm loving this season. I know it started a little slow, but I'm very much enjoying where the season has picked up.
Yes.
I mean, it's fun, man. It's a great show.
It's very fun. It's also great that it's reached a point where you can't even talk about it without spoiling it. You can't say anything. Yeah.
I'm always hesitant because this is not a TV show podcast. It's like someone might be on just episode 3 right now. I don't want to spoil anything. All I'll say is the show gets even better. The show gets weird.
It gets a little crazy.
It gets a little crazy in ways that you might expect and in ways you might not expect. But boy, is it good. And I can't wait till Sunday night to watch White Lotus, because that's what I do, Ben, in my spare time as I watch White Lotus. Thank you for joining me today,
and play
man.
Guitar. Yeah.
And play guitar. Yeah. I got these behind me for a reason. But Ben, thanks for joining me today, man. Always great potting with you.
Thanks for having me, Kevin. Hope it was fun.